Joining me now is the Australian's Foreign Affairs editor, Greg Sheridan. Greg, good to see you. Anthony Albanese would rather focus on the nice stories when it comes to China and this visit, yet we have seen these clashes today. Do you think that the Prime Minister cares about the human rights abuse issues when he's trying to woo Premier Lei?
Well, Danica, great to be with you. I'd give the Albanese government a mixed report. I thought Penny Wong was quite sensible on Insiders on Sunday, listing some of the things we disagree with China about, and very importantly, saying we're in permanent strategic competition with China in the South Pacific. I think this big panda diplomacy visit is all about trying to reset China in the Australian public mind as a sweet and cuddly thing, whereas it's not a sweet and cuddly thing, it's a vicious, brutal, totalitarian dictatorship. And I think in several key ways the Prime Minister has underperformed in this visit, very significantly. First of all, on the Cheng Lei matter. Now, it's not a huge incident. I greatly admire Cheng Lei, but this is not a huge incident. It wasn't a fundamental breach of her human rights, but it was absolutely improper behaviour for foreign diplomats to try to muscle their way around the Australian Parliament House. Now, if Albanese wasn't briefed, he has the most incompetent prime ministerial office in Sydney, and the government is fast asleep and should be sacked for incompetence. If he was briefed but wasn't game to simply say, I don't want to overblow this incident, but the Chinese officials were plainly out of order, that's not the way we react, that's not the way we treat journalists in Australia, well, then he's a coward, and he has ceded an element of Australian democracy to China. The same with the demonstrators. No other embassy in Canberra can organise busloads of demonstrators to intimidate and influence Australian politics. That's inconsistent with diplomatic practice. Imagine if the Australian embassy in Beijing tried it for a single second. Now, governments of both persuasions, the Liberals were as pathetic on this as Labor, have not enforced on the Chinese embassy in Canberra the proper restrictions which should apply to an embassy. God alone knows why we allow so many Chinese diplomats to stay in this country, and it is a standing rebuke to the pusillanimity of Australian governments that they won't restrict the Chinese embassy to behaving like an embassy, which doesn't include organising busloads of demonstrators and doesn't include manhandling Australian reporters in our own parliament.
Well, I just think it's extraordinary, as you said, that this has happened on Australian soil when we have an open and free Australian press in a democratic nation. Do you think that, in fact, the Prime Minister needs to raise this with the Chinese Premier?
So, Danica, I don't want to be unbalanced about this. It's not a huge incident, but Albanese has made it a bigger incident than it needs be because of his apparent extreme timidity about saying, but he's so scared to say anything that might annoy the Chinese and derail this visit. He doesn't need to raise this matter with the Premier. He simply needed to say at the press conference, this is a small incident but completely unacceptable. We utterly stand with Cheng Lei. She's an Australian citizen, an Australian journalist, and this behaviour by the Chinese officials was unacceptable. Then if the Chinese decide to overreact to that, that's up to them. But he is so scared, the Albanese government is so scared that if they say one word out of the Chinese-approved script, they'll get a bad reaction. So the analogous case was after he met with Xi Jinping in San Francisco, 4 or 5 days after the Chinese Navy had fired sonars at Australian naval divers and caused them physical injury. He still won't tell us, the Prime Minister, whether he raised that with Xi Jinping, which probably means he didn't raise it because there'd be no reason not to tell us. But then he had a press conference but made sure that Canberra didn't release the information about this incident until after the press conference was over. Well, this kind of sort of pathetic timidity, it's unbecoming. I mean, Albo, I've got a lot of admiration. I think he's a good bloke, but this is unbecoming. This looks like a Prime Minister who's got stage fright, who can't cope with the Chinese just in a normal way. It doesn't have to be, I think Dutton and Morrison did overdo the rhetoric. Doesn't have to go down that road. But if he can't call out egregious Chinese misbehaviour, even on our own soil, well, that's an overreaction. It's too defensive. It's too timid.